Hello, this is Jason, and a new story on my author's channel.
The flint dust from the shot had not yet settled when the California Brigade soldier fell to the ground, arms crossed over his chest, as if trying to hide from a blow he had not yet seen. There was a look of surprise in his eyes that was more like bewilderment than pain. There was determination in his posture, but no fear. Just a strange feeling that this had all happened before. "It's time," she said, without moving, without making unnecessary gestures. A Ukrainian girl in a T-shirt with a faded coat of arms. Her face was expressionless, like a painting that could be put on the wall and forgotten. The training was routine, standard, with scripts prepared for students from all over the world. But there was no room for her in any of the scripts. And yet, every other soldier, without exception, found themselves in her shadow at some point. A schoolgirl, almost a teenager, no more than 16, had no right to be here. But her precision, her movements, all of this evoked feelings in the American soldiers that they could not name and did not try to understand. It seemed to them that she knew not only how to shoot, but how to do it in a way that erased meaning from the very nature of time and space. A second, too. One of the soldiers jerked to the side, but her bullet had already pierced the prepared target. Only the sound of the shot was still ringing in their ears, and everyone knew that there was no more time to evaluate. The coach stood in the distance. He looked at the screen, at the numbers flashing before his eyes, and felt his heart clench. This was wrong, not how it was supposed to be. She knows how to do this, he thought, but he couldn't find an answer to the question that was already invading his consciousness. What if she wasn't the only one here? What if others had gone through this? And then he realized that none of the targets were real to her. They were all empty traces. She was no longer just going through training. She was part of something much more complex. She walked into the U.S. training camp just as the coordinate system was beginning to unravel. Everything here was familiar, yet strangely alien. She was remembered clearly from distant Ukrainian schools where the lights were dimmed and generators turned on, and from streets filled with soldiers. But in this camp full of trained specialists, she was a shadow. She didn't really exist here. Her name was Alia. Nothing more, nothing less. She did nothing important, but in her world every moment hung on the edge. The line between what seemed normal and what destroyed the familiar reality had already been erased. The Ukrainian school she came from was not a place where soldiers were trained. It taught physics and chemistry, history and literature, but it never taught what was required here. The old reality, where her actions were limited to a chair at a desk and notebooks, was now only a foggy background. Everything she knew had disappeared, leaving no trace. When Alia first found herself in the center of the training camp, her head was buzzing with noise, but despite this, she did not feel fear. Hundreds of people learning skills that were supposed to protect the motherland. Soon they began to notice her. Not immediately, but quickly enough. Eyes closely watching her hands, her movements, were already beginning to figure out her type. Soldiers and trainers exchanged glances, noting that she was not like everyone else. She solved the tasks that were given to her with such ease that no one had time to understand how it happened. Every shot, every maneuver, perfection. Defeat. The enemy did not have time to understand what happened to him and was already out of the game. Her precision was frightening. She didn't watch the indicators on the screens. She knew how to shoot, how to hide, how to pick up a weapon, like an art that she learned alone, in the atmosphere of her country's tragedy, in its very essence. The power of military strategies that she acquired not in the training halls, but in real situations, where every move decided lives, made her unique. It was her weapon, her way of survival. The training went on, but behind every step, every action of Alia, there was a dynamic that was incomprehensible to others. She was not like the soldiers, like those who were trained. Her movements were like a watershed, and every shot was not just hitting the target, but revealing everything that they could not understand. Every moment was more than just training. For the others, it was a tool, a technique, a science. For her, it was life. Her life. The camp commander, a combat veteran, was deep in thought, his eyes filled with worry. Being from Virginia and having worked in the world's hotspots, he was experienced enough to notice that something unusual was going on. A strange feeling. A discrepancy. Alia's gaze was cold and clear, but behind it lurked an unknown force that could only be avoided. He noticed how her movements were not just precise, but incredibly precise. She seemed connected to something inaccessible to everyone else. There was a harmony in her body that was devoid of meaningless actions. It was as if she was absorbing the air, but only with the purpose of becoming part of it, like an ancient warrior who knows the point that needs to be hit. For the trainer, it seemed something inexpressible. He could not find an explanation. But the more he watched her, the more questions he had. Why wasn't she keeping track of the time on the screens? Why weren't her shots leaving any trace in the database? He'd seen how the system was giving her incorrect accuracy data, how the coder was stalling, not understanding what was happening. Everything about her actions didn't match reality. There were times when she seemed to do things that shouldn't have been done. There were times when her shots hit the target before the system had a chance to register them. All these oddities, these anomalies, did not give the coach any peace. He began to feel that in the reality that he had always considered stable, something was beginning to collapse. And it became increasingly clear to him, her presence in the camp was not an accident. The world in which these soldiers existed was entirely subject to the laws of reality, where everything could be understood and predicted. But Alia, it seemed, was not simply breaking these laws. She was ignoring them. When the team of trainers and soldiers realized that her unique abilities could be much more important than they imagined, she was already part of what was haunting them. Something hidden but elusive began to unfold inside her, and this was only the beginning. The training continued, but Alia was no longer just a participant. She was not just a boy who was given a chance to go through standard tests. She was something else. Something went beyond simple training tasks, replacing their true essence. The tasks became more and more difficult, but she remained unwaveringly calm. There was some inner tension in her eyes that was difficult to describe in words. Something was missing in these tests. Something did not add up. She felt that her abilities were just a temporary mask, under which something much more dangerous and inexplicable was hidden. Alia did not ask herself why she could do what others could not. She could not understand how it happened, but at the same time it was so natural that her every move was like one big must. She walked along training fields where soldiers had to act in impossible situations, but for her, these situations were not impossible. It was like an exhalation, like a consequence of many years of trials that she had endured on the streets, where her homeland, her family, and her people already knew what survival was. But she did not feel bitterness. It was indifference, which she had learned to perceive as the deepest form of awareness. With each passing day, her behavior became more and more strange to those around her. It was like a dance in which she was part of the music, but still could not become its center. Strange. And it was not only her actions that remained incomprehensible. Other signs began to appear in a strange way, and they could not be explained by any logic. More and more soldiers noticed that her movements seemed to adjust to spatiotemporal contexts. Sometimes she was too fast, sometimes too precise. But most importantly, her actions seemed to cause a shift in time. Sometimes strange distortions would appear on the screens in front of the coaches, as if the algorithm tracking her movements itself was beginning to freeze at the moment of recording. For a few seconds, the data on her shots or her actions would disappear. However, her accuracy remained at a level that seemed unnatural. Each shot was like a prediction, and yet everything remained within the bounds of normality. One way or another, she remained part of the process, part of the program, part of the team. Coach Michael, the man who had been monitoring her progress from the start, was the one who sensed the strangeness the most. He had seen her before the training began, when she had been brought here from some military camp in Eastern Europe. And somehow he had felt it immediately. She was not here. Not in the sense that she was somewhere physical or not present in the process. On the contrary, she was too here, as if her existence in this place was not quite real. When she walked into the training center, her silhouette was too sharp for this space, too out of place in the environment where the steely reality of training and reporting reigned. Something in her movements, in her stillness beyond the ordinary, indicated that she could not be part of this program. It was not just a feeling, but something deep inside Michael that he could not hide from himself. When he approached her after one of the tests, his voice was low, with a slight displeasure. "Are you ready for the next step?" Her answer was short, but too firm to seem normal. "Yes." "It's not difficult." It wasn't selfishness. It wasn't self-confidence. It was something different. It was knowledge. And despite all his rationality, Michael felt like everything he knew about reality was crumbling in that moment. Alia looked like someone who had already been through all this. Too confident. And strangely accurate. He turned away and walked toward the office where the analytics team was working. He couldn't trust the data coming in from her training anymore. When he looked at the screen, the image froze again for a split second. The system couldn't process her actions. The screen filled with white light, and that moment was so short that it seemed like his gaze had slipped into a space where there was no continuation. The report of her training didn't match the actual results. He picked up the tablet and studied the code carefully. It all looked like a bug in the system, but not an error. "It's like she's doing the impossible," said one of the technicians, Ryan, peering closely at the data. "What do you mean?" Michael asked, leaning slightly toward the screen. "Reports are one thing. The training time, the results. They happen. These aren't just numbers, Michael," Ryan said, turning the tablet toward him. "These results weren't supposed to happen. Do you understand? These training sessions, they couldn't have ended like this. She's moving space. Statistics are one thing, but look at what's happening in real time. She's not just shooting faster. She's predicting where she's going to hit before the bullet leaves the barrel. That can't be right." Michael frowned. He felt that this was not a programming error. This seemed deeper than just a random anomaly. It all seemed to be reaching for one answer, an answer that was hidden in what Alia was doing without realizing it. It was like she was part of a program designed not for training, but for something much deeper, something that was happening beyond the observable data. That night, Michael couldn't sleep. He reviewed the records and reports over and over again, but the same questions kept popping up in his head. Who was she? Where had she been before? Why was her movement not just perfect, but somehow predictable? None of these questions could be explained by anything ordinary. Time dragged on inexorably, but it seemed as if rifts were beginning to appear in it, pushing space and reality apart. It all seemed to be becoming unbearably difficult. And the deeper he delved, the more he felt that Alia was not just part of the program. She could be the key. To what? Michael did not know. But there was no doubt that she was not a random element. And if he did not figure out what was happening, the reality they were all accustomed to would simply disappear. Every day the training became more intense, but the tension did not go away. Alia was like an unimaginable detail in a complex machine that no one could understand, but everyone felt that it was not working as it should. At first, everyone probably thought that it was just a coincidence, her incredible precision, her ability to predict the course of events. But with each new exercise it became clear it was not a coincidence. Something was happening beyond ordinary perception, something that could not be explained in simple terms of physics or psychology. More and more people began to wonder, who is she really? The training continued, and her successes became more and more stunning. She easily passed through the most difficult scenarios, where others began to panic or lost their way. But to everyone's surprise, Alia was neither nervous nor exhausted. She was like a void that did not feel tired, like a face that reflected neither joy nor bitterness. And even her movements were surprisingly calm, almost meditative, but with such precision that it made others feel a strange sense of anxiety. One day, after another difficult task, when her actions were again impeccable, Michael and Ryan found themselves in the office with reports. Michael's gaze was intense. He could no longer ignore the oddities. "Listen, Ryan, look at this." He held out a tablet that contained data on Alia's reaction time, accuracy, and success rates. "It's impossible. The results can't be that consistent, that perfect. With every shot she makes, the system detects instability." Ryan studied the screen carefully, but there was no confidence on his face. He leaned back in his chair and, as if in thought, said, "I know what you're talking about, but it all feels like something else. It's like she's playing the system. What we see is the result of some kind of distortion. As if reality itself disagrees with her, and she, in turn, pumps it up, or changes the course of events." Michael frowned at him. He didn't know what to think. His gut feeling was that they didn't understand the full scope of what was going on, and it made him nervous. He had always been able to control situations, but here he felt that if he didn't find the answers to his questions, things might get out of hand. "You do understand that if this is true, then we are dealing with something that goes beyond our knowledge," he said, not hiding his concern. Ryan didn't answer right away. He seemed to be thinking about it, looking for a way to justify what was happening, but all his attempts led to one thing. Alia was something alien to this world. Her actions violated the usual patterns, and this was becoming more and more obvious. Meanwhile, Alia remained in her own world. She no longer communicated with other training participants, did not try to engage in conversations, did not seek attention. In her world, there was only movement, only action. Everything else seemed unnecessary. She felt neither satisfaction from a completed task nor frustration from failure. All her attention was focused on the process, not the end result. Her eyes were not in the present, but as if they were somewhere far away in another dimension. She was attentive, but not in the usual sense. She felt the space around her, as if she had a vision that allowed her to see not only what was in front of her, but also what existed in parallel realities. Every step she took, every shot, every movement of her hands was not just a reaction to an external threat, but a conscious choice that built her own trajectory. Her behavior was beginning to be very different from everyone else. When other soldiers were nervous or panicking, trying to figure out what was happening, she remained calm, as if she had already lived through this moment. But what was bothering her was the growing sense that her actions had become something much more significant than just completing tasks. Alya felt like she was on the edge of something that was not her choice. She was becoming part of something bigger, and it was causing her anxiety that she could not express. Sometimes, in the middle of the night, she would wake up in her room and go to the window to look at the stars. There were no thoughts about the future in her head, no questions about what would happen next. Just this moment. Just the space beneath her feet and the darkness that enveloped everything around her. But even in this darkness, she felt the world around her begin to distort, as if the universe itself was trying to give her answers, but Alya couldn't understand them. She was too busy to realize what was happening to her consciousness. One evening, after one of the night trainings, as she stood on the simulation platform with the other soldiers, Michael approached her. He could no longer ignore his suspicions and finally decided to talk to her, trying to understand what kind of person she was. Alya, his voice was even, but with a slight tension. Have you ever wondered why you get through all these training sessions so easily? Do you even feel what's happening? She turned to him, and her gaze was, as always, emotionless. He couldn't understand what exactly was in her eyes, but it was a look that penetrated him, as if she saw him not only in this moment, but in some other dimension. Everything has a meaning, she answered quietly. I know what's happening. The words hung in the air, and Michael felt a chill run down his spine. She didn't say it with a challenge or confidence. She simply said it as a fact. Do you know? He asked, trying not to show his excitement. What exactly do you know? Alya was silent for a moment, her eyes again looking somewhere into the distance. It was not so much a realization as a feeling that would be difficult to explain. Everything I do is a choice, she said finally. But I don't always have a choice. Sometimes I have to make it. Michael paused, trying to process her words. They didn't make sense, but they also felt true. He knew she was saying something important, but he didn't know how to interpret it. She wasn't part of this world, but that didn't mean she was something from the outside world. It was something that blurred the lines. And that feeling was becoming more and more obvious with each passing day. As the days dragged on, Michael increasingly felt that he could not control what was happening. He tried to monitor the results of the training, but each new report brought only new questions. Every move, every action of hers became more and more mysterious, not connected with anything that could be explained by a scientific approach. All this led him to the idea that Alya was not just a soldier, but part of something else, some paradox that they could not yet comprehend. Alya was not who she seemed. And if she was part of some program, then that program violated all the laws, all the principles they were trying to understand. In this camp, in this training, her existence was just a fragment of something much larger and more nebulous. Alya didn't feel pressure. Even if those around her saw how hard the training was for others, she didn't feel tired. With each new day, her movements became more confident and precise, as if reality itself was subordinate to her desires. She no longer took part in ordinary conversations with other soldiers. All that concerned her was the actions taking place in her world. This world was more than just training, more than the campgrounds. It was something at once distant and close. Alya felt herself beginning to dissolve in it, becoming part of something much larger than she could have imagined. Her training became more and more unusual with each time. The unreal accuracy of her shots, the ability to manipulate time in her reality, all this was so superhuman that even her mentors began to doubt what they were seeing. More and more strange reports appeared on the screens in front of them, a few seconds of no data on her actions, and then the return of full cartography with an exact calculation that did not fit into the usual framework. It was as if she turned off the space around her, forgetting that she must exist in the system. And in these pauses, when all reality froze, the same question was spinning in Michael's head. Who is she? One day, when the next tests began at the training center, which were supposed to demonstrate its readiness to work in extreme conditions, everything did not go as planned. It was one of the most difficult scenarios. A group of soldiers had to carry out an evacuation mission from a destroyed area, and it was important not only to get through ambushes, but also to respond to immediate threats that appeared in different parts of the field. Alya, as always, walked calmly. She moved among the others, but her behavior defied any explanation. She did not try to take a step forward or a step back. She was in no hurry. And then, when the moment came when everything was supposed to end, an exact imitation of a real combat situation, she found herself in the center. At the moment when everything began, something strange happened. In one of the window blocks where the snipers were supposed to be working, Michael noticed something that made his heart skip a beat. It wasn't something unusual about the training itself, but something that suggested that not everything that happens is the result of chance. The trajectory of the shot was indescribably clear from the holes through which the sniper was shooting. It wasn't random. And what was even stranger was that at that moment, Alya seemed to already know what was going to happen. Michael looked at her face. It showed neither alarm nor fear. And at that moment, when the shot was almost ready, Alya, in a single movement, tore the weapon out of the hands of another soldier and fired accurately into the same windows, destroying the sniper before he had time to aim. All this happened instantly. But what was even stranger was that the system report showed no change. At the moment of impact, when time froze, the camera recorded her shot only a few seconds later. Time, as if, did not obey the laws. Michael was taken aback. Not just by her precision, but by the way she interacted with space. At that moment, it became clear to him that something global was happening to this girl. It was as if she already knew all the moves, as if she was one step ahead of everyone. And this feeling was not just physical. It was like a sense of another world, hidden behind visible reality, where time and space had different laws. After the training, Michael couldn't stand it any longer and approached Alya. She was standing alone, far from the other soldiers, staring into space. Alya, he began, trying to remain calm. What did you do? She turned slowly towards him, her gaze completely neutral, as if she had just woken up from a long sleep. I did what had to be done. Her voice was quiet but firm. What you couldn't do. It wasn't self-confidence. It was knowledge. But knowledge that couldn't be explained by any logical scheme. She knew she had to do it that way. But what did that mean? Michael paused, feeling his thoughts begin to drift apart. Something told him she was more than just a soldier, more than just part of the system, but something much bigger than any of them could understand. After this incident, Alya became even more withdrawn. She avoided conversations and almost never left the training center. Every step she took was careful and calculated. She did not seek communication, but everything around her began to waver in a strange way. Everything that happened was perceived as temporary, lacking solidity. Even the air seemed to lose its density. There was no room for chance or uncertainty in her world. Her every move was already predetermined, and the very space around her figure seemed to obey her laws. One day, Michael couldn't stand it any longer and approached her again. He didn't know what to expect, but in his mind there was no other way out. He had to understand what was happening to her. Alya, his voice was quiet, almost uncertain. What's going on? Why are you acting as if you know everything in advance? You somehow control reality. It's impossible. She didn't answer right away, but simply looked at him. There was no threat or fear in her gaze. She looked as if she was seeing him for the first time, with interest and calm at the same time. Time isn't a line, Michael, she said, as if she were stating something obvious, something that had been known for a long time. It's just space that we occupy. It won't always be the same. Time isn't what you think. He couldn't understand what she meant. There was something in her words that went beyond his comprehension. It wasn't philosophy. It wasn't an explanation. It was a feeling he couldn't understand, but which he was beginning to feel with every word she said. He was silent, trying to comprehend what she had just said, but his gaze darted over her face, trying to see even the slightest spark of emotion. She had not changed. She was like a void that filled the space. You don't see what's happening, Michael, she added finally. You don't see that time is already changing. You yourself will soon understand that not everything is as it seems. He stood silently, not knowing what to say, and that silence was his greatest fear. Because there was no question in her words. There was certainty in her words. Certainty that something was about to change, and that they would not be able to stop it. Michael couldn't shake the feeling that time had become something fluid for him. It was like mercury, slipping through his fingers, defying definition. He tried to focus on the familiar, but even the mundane tasks began to seem absurd. It was as if reality itself was beginning to tilt, breaking into pieces that didn't make sense. Everything pointed to something changing dramatically, but he didn't know how to stop it. After his last conversation with Alia, her words began to echo in his head, distorted by time. She spoke of time not as a linear process, but as a space that they fill. He tried to find an explanation, but only emptiness arose in his mind. He knew that Alia was not simply speaking cryptic phrases. She was revealing something more, something he could not understand. His relationships with the other soldiers were becoming increasingly strained. No one knew what was happening to Alia, and each day was becoming a greater challenge for them. Even Ryan, who was the person with whom Michael could always discuss the most difficult issues, was beginning to see things differently. He increasingly avoided communication and hid in his observations, but Michael had the feeling that Ryan and everyone else around him had already begun to forget what ordinary reality was. One night when training was particularly tough, Michael found himself in the hallway with Ryan. He was trying to find answers, but the questions were only growing. Talking about how to fix the system, how to get things back on track, was no longer meaningful. Ryan seemed distant, his eyes were dull, and his words came out mechanically. "Have you noticed how it's all changing?" Michael asked. "Time, space, the people around us. We can't understand what's happening, but we all feel it. They're starting to forget who they really are." Ryan looked at him with a weariness that spoke louder than words. He didn't answer, but his gaze was full of worry. "I see it," he said finally, a little tiredly. "But I'm not sure there's anything we can do. What's happening to Alia? It's not just an accident. We can't control it. We can't control this." Michael felt a chill run down his spine at his words. He knew Ryan was right. Everything that was happening seemed preordained, as if they were playing a game whose rules they had not made. But who made the rules? And why was Alia the central figure in this game? Meanwhile, Alia continued her training, oblivious to the rest of the world. She seemed distant, as if she existed in another time, another dimension. Even when her actions were flawless and her successes amazed everyone, she remained as if apart from reality, not involved in the process. All she cared about was fulfilling her mission, following her path. But even her invisible isolation couldn't hide what was happening to her. She no longer felt human. Her body, her consciousness, all of it had become part of some unknown structure that existed beyond normal perception. She couldn't explain what was happening to her, but she felt that her existence was no longer limited. She wasn't just a soldier following orders. She was someone who had seen more than others, who knew things no one else could understand. Her nighttime experiences became more and more disturbing. Alia woke up in a dark room. Her gaze slid around the room, but she did not see the usual things. Everything around seemed to dissolve, became unclear, foggy. In these moments, it seemed to her that the world was disappearing, and she remained the only link connecting reality and this new world that she began to sense. Every night, when she got out of bed, it felt like time was slowing down, like the space around her was beginning to bend and disintegrate into elements. It wasn't fear. It was the realization that she had no control over what was happening, and the feeling was unbearable, as if reality was as shaky as the water she was drowning in. One day, after another night training, Alia found herself alone in the gym. She stood among empty containers and cars, staring at one place. She felt that something important was about to happen. Her body was tense, and her breathing was slow and even. She did not move, but her consciousness seemed to be breaking out of her body, moving into another reality. Her eyes closed, and fragments of memories that had no place in her life appeared before her. Faces of people she had never met. Places that did not exist in her reality. Sounds that were not there. Everything blended into one picture, which became more and more vivid and distinct. She saw parallel worlds, each of which was alive and full, but, like her own, unstable. At that moment, Michael entered the room. He noticed her immediately, standing there as if she were part of something that did not belong there. He did not know what to say, but his gaze was intense. He felt time slowing down, his presence in this place becoming insignificant, as if he himself was only a small link in a process that had already begun. He came closer, but Alia didn't pay attention to him. She was busy with something of her own. She didn't move, didn't speak. She was absorbed in what was happening in her mind. "Alia," he said finally, not knowing what to say next. She turned slowly, her gaze as blank as ever, but this time Michael saw something different in her eyes, something that could not be explained in words. She was looking at him, but she did not see him. Her consciousness was somewhere far away. "This is not the right place, Michael," she said quietly. "This is not the right time. You can't understand what's happening. This is all just a moment." Her words pierced him again. There was a confidence in their tone, a calm that felt like a reality in which she was no longer part of their world. And then, before he could respond, the space around them changed. The entire room was gone. It seemed to melt away, leaving only emptiness. Time and place became as fluid as fog. Michael closed his eyes and felt the world around him disappear, swallowed up by her presence. When he opened his eyes again, he was in the same room. But something had changed. Alia was standing in the same place, but now her face was expressionless. Her eyes were empty, and her body seemed motionless. Time had returned to its usual speed, but the feeling that everything around them was not real remained. Michael couldn't understand what was happening, but he knew one thing: they couldn't go back. Michael stood in silence, feeling every sound in his ears echo in this empty space. He wanted to go to Alia, but something held him back, like an invisible wall separating him from her. She didn't move. She didn't react. She just stood there like a rock, not disturbing the peace, not giving him answers. Michael looked around. The training room was the same, but everything around him had changed. The space seemed to stretch, as if it had lost its shape. The walls began to dim, and a light emanated from within Alia herself. It was not a glow, not a radiance. Rather, her very figure became the center of an invisible energy that distorted the space around her. He even felt his body begin to tremble from this unnatural force. Alia was no longer a person, not a soldier. She was something more. And that was clear. He took a step forward and suddenly froze. Images flashed through his mind, moments he had never experienced but knew were in another time, another place. Faces of people who had been his allies but now seemed alien. Eyes that were empty. Faces that grew blurrier with each passing moment, as if they were being erased from memory. Sounds that didn't fit into their usual pattern, and the space around them began to shrink and then expand again. "Alia," his voice wavered. It was the only thing he could say. She didn't react, and at that moment Michael felt a cold shiver run down his spine. He took another step forward, but his movement seemed slow. It was as if time didn't allow him to move quickly. He found himself in the center of this space, and all his attempts to comprehend what was happening only added to the confusion. When he looked at her again, Alia was still standing motionless, but now her face was distorted. It was not an expression of fear, not an expression of pain. It was something deeper, more ancient. It was as if she was experiencing not something specific, but something that crossed time and space boundaries. And then everything around them suddenly disappeared. Instead of a hall, instead of the familiar world, they found themselves in emptiness. No walls, no objects, only an endless dark emptiness, infinity that squeezed them, not allowing them to escape. And in this emptiness, as the only element that survived, Alia remained. She was as if in another dimension, but her presence left no doubt. She was still here. Michael couldn't understand what was happening. Every movement he made slowed down. Every breath became unnatural. Alia wasn't just a living being. She was a concentration of energy that could stretch space, change the flow of time. "Do you see this, Michael?" Her voice cut through the silence like fire cutting through the night. "Do you understand what's happening?" Her words weren't just a question. They were a challenge, as if she wasn't asking him a question so much as an invitation to enter her world, a world that was so complex and strange that he couldn't even begin to grasp it. "Alia, what is this?" Michael asked, feeling his own consciousness begin to waver under the pressure of her power. He didn't know how to explain it. He didn't know how to even talk about it. Alia looked at him as if through him. Her eyes were not directed directly at him. They were more than just a look. They were like a window into another world, a world that defied logic. As if she were not here, but in another time, in another place. "You understand," she said, her voice low and deep, with such a certainty that Michael felt his body tense. "You know that I'm not just a person? You know that we're all just parts of this game here. But you don't yet know who's really running this game. As if her words had become reality themselves, he felt the space around him begin to distort, the horizon bend, time begin to move in a different direction. You mean to say that this is an illusion? He breathed out, not understanding how to pronounce these words. No, she said. It's not an illusion. It's another world. You just can't see it yet. We're all part of something much bigger. You and I and everyone here, we're just fragments. And we can't choose where we'll be. But you can understand it. And you can change something. Michael tried to make sense of her words. He didn't know what this game was she was talking about. He didn't know what she meant when she said they were fragments. But something in his mind made him believe. He was beginning to realize that the reality they existed in wasn't the same as everyone else perceived it. Are you saying that we're not here by chance? That we're part of something else? He asked, his voice becoming more forceful. He felt his mind opening up, as if he were suddenly opening his eyes to a world that had always been there, but he couldn't see. Yes, she said, but there was something strange in her voice again. But you have to be willing to understand it. We're all here because we're meant to be here. I can't explain it all to you at once, but you'll see how it's all connected. You'll see that time doesn't exist, Michael. It's just a construct. Michael felt the world around him begin to fade again. He seemed to be standing still, but the space around him was falling apart, and he could not hold on to anything in this shaky world. He wanted to ask her something else, but the words would not come out. Everything began to blur, like water, like a dream from which he could not wake up. You will become part of it. Her words became increasingly cloudy. You already are. Time will not go back, Michael. You will stand still and watch everything change around you. You will search for answers, but each answer will only be a question. At that moment, he felt his body suddenly lose all weight, as if he were suddenly falling into infinity. He tried to close his eyes, but he couldn't. He couldn't turn around. He couldn't leave or return. When he opened his eyes, everything was normal again, but it was no longer his world. Michael sat in his office, surrounded by the familiar silence. The training center, the soldiers, the equipment, everything as usual. He tried to focus on the tasks he had been assigned, but every action he took, every word he spoke, seemed out of context. Nothing was as it should have been. He tried to come back to reality, but the shadow of what had happened in the room would not leave him. Time gave him no respite. With each passing minute, it became more hostile, as if it were mocking him, sucking his strength and taking away his clarity. Michael stood up, went to the window, but saw a world that was not the one it should have been. He suddenly realized that the people around him, his colleagues, friends, acquaintances, were the same puppets in this reality as he was. He felt their presence, but their essences remained foggy for him, as if their faces were constantly changing, but he could not discern who they really were. He closed his eyes, trying to shake off the growing sense of helplessness. These moments when everything around him lost its shape and events turned into an amorphous substance continued and led him into unknown areas of his consciousness. He felt how thoughts, like a foggy trace of memories, began to spin in his head, driving him crazy. He remembered Alia, her looks, her words, her ability to see something more. But what was it? And why did everything she said and everything that happened not fit into the familiar picture of the world? Michael could not understand. He knew that she was not like everyone else. He knew that she knew something that they could not understand. He closed his eyes again, and the next moment he was back where he was. The same emptiness. The same cold, inexplicable world they both lived in. Alia was there. But now she wasn't standing still. She was moving. And it wasn't just movement. It was something bigger. It was as if she was dissolving into thin air, as if her body was becoming part of something larger. You don't understand, Michael. Her voice was in his head, but not his words. It was something deeper, something more meaningful. We are not where we think we are. Everything you see is just a reflection of what should be. But it changes as we change. You can feel it already, can't you? He opened his eyes. Alia was standing in front of him, but now her face was blurred, unclear. It seemed to mutate, changing with every glance he cast at her. It was impossible to understand who she was. It was impossible to understand what she was doing here, among these strange worlds, and what awaited her beyond these realities. What do you want from me? He asked, his voice tense, but in a tone he could barely recognize himself. Alia didn't answer right away. She stood there like a statue, motionless, as if waiting. Michael noticed how her figure began to smoothly dissolve into the air, as if her flesh was flowing into space. But despite this, he still felt her presence. Not physical, but something much more. "I don't want you to understand," she finally said, her voice echoing in the void. "I want you to feel. You can't understand everything with your mind, Michael. This isn't a world where everything can be explained. This isn't a world where we find answers. There are no answers here. There is only you and me." Michael felt his own reality begin to fall apart. He wanted to say something, but the words wouldn't come. He couldn't believe that all this was happening to him. It couldn't be true. But then what was true? What was reality? Everything around him began to blur again. His body seemed to lose its shape. He felt his consciousness begin to take over everything that was around him, dissolving and disintegrating every memory. He could see himself, a small part of this greater reality, but everything he knew, everything he saw, was inconsistent, breaking all laws. Everything was wrong. Michael turned away from Alia and looked at himself. His hands had become transparent, like smoke. He felt his body, his physical shell, beginning to disappear, dissolve, lose shape. He knew it was connected to Alia, to her presence, to what she could see. This was not a dream. This was not a vision. This was something much larger and stranger. And despite the fear he felt, he also felt something important, as if he were part of some great process. He looked at her again, but now she was gone. She had disappeared, dissolved into this emptiness, leaving behind only her trace, which was beginning to fade, like footprints on water. Michael felt himself slipping away. His body, his mind, his sense of the world, all of it was fading. He tried to cling to something concrete, but he couldn't. He knew she was there again, somewhere in this space. But she was different. She was a part of this, just like he was. Suddenly he found himself in a different place. This wasn't a gym. This wasn't his office. This wasn't a place he knew. He stood on a mountainside, a wasteland, a fog stretching out before him. He could make out the shapes of people in the distance, but they were so far away that their figures were indistinct. Everything was unclear. Michael felt his consciousness begin to distort again, as if he wasn't here. Everything around him seemed like fragments from other worlds. He took a step, but something stopped him. He couldn't move. He couldn't move forward. Then a figure appeared in the air. Alia. But her face was distorted, like a reflection in a crooked mirror. She was not in her body again. She was something more. Part of the world, part of something else. "You can't go on," she said. There was no threat in her voice, but something like understanding. "You will understand, but you can't go back." Michael took another step, but his legs did not move. He stood in this endless space, surrounded by fog, and felt that his consciousness was leaving, but his body remained. Alia looked at him, and his gaze also dissolved. "You're already part of this world," she said, her face gone. "You can't go back. We all can't go back." Michael closed his eyes, and the world disappeared again. Michael woke up as if from a long, heavy sleep. He wasn't in his office, and there were no empty walls of the training center, no familiar smells. He was somewhere new, but everything felt familiar. He stood on a narrow street, and before him was a picture of a small town swallowed by the evening fog. A light drizzle enveloped everything around him, smoothing the edges of the buildings, softening the lines. This was not the reality he knew, and yet there was nothing alien here. Everything was familiar, but not of this world. Or was it another? He took a few steps, but his feet felt as if they were in the void, as if he were walking on some thin cracks in this world. It was silent around him. There were no people, no sounds, only rain. The same rain that touched his skin, but it was not real. He felt its drops spreading in the air, disappearing before they touched the ground. Suddenly he heard footsteps behind him. He looked back and froze. On the same street, from the opposite direction, a figure appeared. It was a man, but his face was hidden in the shadow of a hood, and his steps were too precise, too determined. Michael couldn't figure out who it was. He could only feel his own body beginning to react to that strange gaze, something more than just observation. It wasn't a threat, but he sensed that the figure knew something important, something he hadn't yet understood. The man came closer, and as his footsteps grew louder, Michael realized that this was no accidental crossing. This was someone's choice, and the choice had been made long ago. "You came." The voice was quiet, but sounded with such confidence that it seemed as if this man knew him much more than he knew himself. Michael stared at the figure, but he couldn't make out who it was. The voice was familiar, but not his own. It was an alien sound, an alien timbre, but something about it made him doubt. Fragments of images flashed through his mind, unclear and blurry, like stills from an old movie. "Who are you?" he asked, his voice uncertain but demanding. He couldn't believe what was happening. This place, this man, everything was not as it should be. The figure took a step forward, and the hood shifted slightly, revealing a face. Michael felt his heart clench. It was Alia, but her face was something he had never imagined. It was strangely unnatural, as if she herself were part of something greater than just a person. Her eyes were full of the same misty look he had once seen in the training center, but now they were even deeper, even more filled with a knowledge he could not understand. "Do you understand now?" Her voice was not the same. It sounded like an echo, like a response from a distant time. Michael recoiled, feeling a wave of foggy awareness wash over his mind. He knew she was not human, that she was part of this very reality he had entered, and he also knew that he himself was now part of this world. He could not go back. He could not simply emerge from this dream, as if his body and his mind had become one. "I understand everything," he said with difficulty, but the words did not come easily, as if they were alien to him. Alia took a step forward, and he felt her presence fill him, like a wave that enveloped everything. She was no longer just a person. She was something more, but he couldn't figure out what. "You still don't see," she said, her eyes full of that same sad wisdom he could no longer shake. "You think you were in your own world, but you weren't. You think you lost yourself, but you were never yourself. You were part of a game." Michael felt his mind begin to split, as if a crack had been cut into it. He knew that what she said was true. He knew that he was not here by accident. He was part of something bigger, something he could not understand. And he felt this unknown envelop him, as if it had become a part of him. "What do you mean?" he asked, feeling his words losing their meaning. The question was rhetorical. He already knew the answer. He just couldn't believe it. Alia didn't answer right away. She took another step forward, and Michael felt his consciousness begin to sink into this space, dissolving in her gaze. His mind could no longer perceive events as a sequence. Everything he knew turned into one big, pulsating uncertainty. "You don't understand that you're living in a script." Her words cut through the silence, but they didn't seem simple to him. They were part of something much bigger. "You were made for this. We're all here, made for this. We're playing roles. But you can step outside the script. You can see more. You can be part of what's happening." What are you saying?" He said the words, but they didn't sound the way he wanted them to. He already knew the answer, but he couldn't quite process it. "You were part of what was happening," she said with the same calm intonation, but her voice was filled with heavy meaning. "Your actions, your life, it was all prepared. You were part of the program. We are all parts." Programs. Michael felt his chest tighten. This was no longer just a verbal explanation. This was a statement that would undoubtedly change the entire picture. Alia looked at him with ruthless understanding. Her eyes seemed to shine through him, penetrating deep into his essence. "You're not the only one. We're all part of the script. And you have to understand that you can't go back. You were taken out of your role, but that doesn't mean you won't be back in it. You were an important part of the game. But you can come out. You can see everything." Michael gritted his teeth. His hands were shaking. His mind was breaking. He couldn't understand what she meant, but it was all too obvious to be a lie. Everything around him felt unnatural. Everything he knew made no sense. But now he knew it wasn't just a game. It was more. "I have to do something," he whispered, but his words were lost in the misty void. Alia nodded silently, her face becoming even more blurry. "It's all already done. You can't change it. You've already become part of this game." Michael stood in the foggy town, feeling his mind begin to intertwine with what he saw and what he couldn't understand. He didn't know what this world was, but he felt himself becoming part of something much larger. He wasn't just an observer. He was an element in this process, an unknown, invisible participant whose actions were leading him through this labyrinth. Alia was gone, vanishing into thin air, leaving only emptiness behind her. But her presence felt like some kind of inevitability, weighing on his every move. She had left something in him, not just a trace, but something much more substantial. Michael felt that all those questions he had asked, all those doubts that had tormented him, were no longer his own. They were part of what was happening here, and now he was forced to go through this path. He walked forward, through the wet streets, sliding along the invisible border of a reality that could no longer be precisely defined. The feeling of weight on his shoulders, as if he were carrying an invisible burden, grew with each step. He knew he had to look for answers, but where? And why did this city seem so familiar? Why was everything about it the way it shouldn't be? Why was the fog in his soul growing thicker? The footsteps echoing down that empty street began to fill his mind, seeming to suck every memory out of him, leaving only a sense of incompleteness. But he kept walking, further and further, until he found himself at the old cafe on the corner. He knew this place. Everything was as it should be, and yet nothing was out of place. He went inside. The warmth of the old fireplace could not dispel the feeling of cold he felt inside. Transparent windows with steamed-up glass, old chairs, cloudy mirrors that reflected not his own eyes, but the faces of people he did not know. He sat down at a table by the window, absorbed by this strange sensation. Had he been here before? When? He could not remember. The waitress came over. Her face was vaguely familiar, but she didn't seem alive. She was part of this world, part of something strange and elusive that he couldn't quite place. She didn't ask him what he wanted to order. She just put the coffee in front of him and walked away. Michael looked at the cup, from which a faint steam seemed to be coming. This coffee was part of something he knew. He had not drunk it before, but he knew that the taste was familiar. Suddenly he felt his consciousness penetrate this moment, as if his existence was connected to this strange cafe, to this strange city, to these strange people whose faces were reflected in the murky mirrors. He lifted the cup and took a sip. The taste was bitter, but not unpleasant. It was exactly the taste he had expected. But there was something more to it, something he couldn't quite place. He closed his eyes, trying to feel this moment, to find some connection to reality. But nothing happened. Just fog. You're still trying to find answers. Alia's voice was like a whisper, penetrating his consciousness, and her image appeared in the reflection on the glass. She stood behind him, but she didn't say anything. She just looked. Where am I? Michael asked, not opening his eyes, but knowing she was nearby. You're already here, she replied. And you're here to realize that you were never where you thought you were. You're part of all of this. I don't understand. His words sounded like a repetition of old phrases, like an attempt to grasp something that was eluding him. Alia stood motionless, her figure dissolving in the mirror. Suddenly, she took a step forward, and now her face was reflected not in the glass, but right in front of him. You're not here, she said, her words cutting into the silence like the edge of a knife. You were never here. You were ripped from your reality. You were part of something else. You can't go back to that world because it doesn't exist. Everything you saw, everything you knew, was a lie. Michael felt his breath catch. He tried to stand up, but his body wouldn't move. He had no control over anything anymore. He wasn't a person, not an object. He was something more. Part of what was happening to him. You can't get your world back, she said quietly, her voice growing more distant. You can't go back to what you knew. Everything you knew was an illusion. You were made for something greater, but you're not ready to understand it. I can't understand this, Michael said, but his words were no longer his own. Alia looked at him with some indescribable depth in her eyes. She was part of something greater, part of the very program that defined his existence. He was an element of this game, and despite what he tried to realize, to try to understand, he knew that this was not his world. This was a world in which he had been torn from his role. And this was not the end. This was the beginning of something else. Alia took a step forward, and Michael felt his consciousness shrink, as if it were being absorbed by her presence. His reality began to blur again. Everything lost its shape, and he felt his physical body dissolving again, like a fading trace on water. You were made to forget. Her words were the last he heard before she disappeared. But you can remember if you want to. With every word she spoke, he felt his own existence losing meaning, as if his essence was dissolving into this space. The fog thickened, consuming him, consuming everything he had once known. And finally he disappeared. Michael woke up. Or rather, he found himself in another place, one that was as real as everything he had left behind. But now his eyes were open. The same city, the same street. But now Michael felt his body filled with a heavy awareness. Everything he had seen before no longer seemed like a dream. It was not a temporary space. It was not just an illusion. It was part of him. He was part of it. He stood at the entrance to the old cafe he had just seen. But now, something was wrong. The fog was thicker. And the longer he stayed here, the more he felt the world around him slowly warp, becoming something alien. The people he had thought were people were now figures. They moved, oblivious to his presence. Their footsteps made no sound. They did not address each other, and Michael could not understand what that meant. He tried to call out to someone, but his voice had no power. He looked at the people, but saw their faces blur, disappearing into shadow. They were becoming part of something greater. He clenched his fists. Despair and rage burned inside him. What was happening to him? Why didn't these people notice him? Why did this world weigh him down so much? Was he really part of something bigger? Or was everything that was happening to him just an illusion, created by someone or something to keep him in the dark? Michael didn't know how long he stood there, among those blurry figures that continued to move in their aimless rhythm. But when he finally decided to go deeper into the city, his gaze fell again on a familiar face. He froze. Alia. She stood at the crossroads, motionless, as if waiting for him. Her eyes held the same misty mystery as before, but now her face was more than just familiar. It was part of this world. She was part of it. You're here again. Her voice wasn't loud, but it penetrated his consciousness as if she were speaking to him directly. Michael felt his heart beat faster. He knew that her appearance was no accident. He knew that she could answer his questions, or at least give him a direction that could lead him to the truth. But his mind was already so confused that even this moment made no sense. He did not know if she could be who she claimed to be, or if her form was part of something much more complex. You weren't supposed to come back, she said, her eyes still looking straight at him, as if she could see right through him. You were free. What do you mean, free? His voice was firm, but there was a sense of confusion in it. Did I miss something? This isn't real. She didn't answer right away. She just stood there, as if trying to figure out what question he really wanted to ask. You're trying to find logic in this world, she said finally. But you can't. This world is no place for logic. Michael turned away, feeling this conversation go into an endless circle again. He couldn't understand what she meant. He couldn't understand what was happening to him. There was no logic in this world, no order. Everything around him was becoming more and more absurd. He tried to find some kind of foothold, but his entire perception was crumbling. If this world doesn't make sense, he said, then why am I still in it? Why can't I just leave? Alia looked at him with such a soft, almost sad smile that it added even more bewilderment. Because you were made to be here. Her voice sounded like music he knew but didn't remember. You were part of a program. You were ripped from one world, but now you're here to complete your existence. Finish, Michael repeated, feeling a chill run down his spine. What should I finish? Alia took another step forward. That same misty depth that seemed to absorb everything around her appeared in her eyes again. You were part of the game, she said. You were part of the task. But you must understand that nothing will end until you complete this path. A path you cannot control. Michael suddenly realized that he couldn't stand any longer. He felt his legs begin to shake. He looked at her, but her gaze was too heavy for him to continue talking. He knew she was right. He knew that everything that was happening to him was part of a plan. But what was this plan? And who was the architect of this world? Alia didn't say another word. She just stood there, like a silent date, as if she expected him to accept her words, to accept this reality. Suddenly, Michael felt his consciousness begin to fade again. Not physically, but as if his perceived reality was beginning to melt away, like butter on a hot pan. He felt his body becoming light again, as if it were dissolving into thin air. He was on the edge again, between worlds, between reality and illusion. He tried to grab onto something, but he couldn't. He tried to understand what was happening, but his thoughts became more and more chaotic. Soon even Alia disappeared, dissolving into this empty world, leaving him alone. He was alone again, and everything around began to disappear. The fog thickened. Michael opened his eyes. Or maybe it wasn't quite opening his eyes. He could have said that everything he saw was a ghost, but the sensation was so sharp and real that it was even more paradoxical. He could feel the ground beneath his feet, damp and cold, and he could feel the air cutting through him, leaving icy tracks along his sides. But the strangest thing was the feeling that everything he had once known had fallen apart into separate pieces, and those pieces couldn't find each other. And with each passing moment, there were fewer of them. The world he entered was cold and empty. He stood on an empty road paved with stones, but there were no buildings or people around. There was no sound, no movement. All that remained were his echoing footsteps and the silence. The silence was too thick, as if it too was part of this reality. Michael looked around again, and then he noticed that the sky above him had no color or shape, and the air itself seemed to have no smell. Everything disappeared into some kind of foggy void that filled his mind. He tried to turn his head, but as his gaze slid over the horizon, he felt his body begin to lose sensation. It was like the feeling when you suddenly realize you can no longer keep your balance, and all this happens at the same time that your hands become invisible. Suddenly, everything around him began to move. At first, it was just a wavering, as if his consciousness sensed something that was trying to grab him, something that had no form. This fog, or rather, something larger that hid behind it, grew denser with each step. Suddenly, he saw a figure in front of him. His gaze darted there, and in that instant of time, everything changed again. She stood in the same place where she had stood before. Alia. But now she was different. Her face was inexpressibly familiar, but at the same time it could not belong to the person he knew. She did not stand as he remembered her. Now her figure seemed to be connected to the fog, to this distorted world, and every step she took created an illusion, as if she were part of this space, and not a separate being. You can't leave. Her voice was not like any he had heard before. It was hollow and raspy, as if she were speaking through layers of sound. It was hard to process, but in his mind, the words seemed to resonate with something far older than his own perception. Michael tried to take a step, but his body wouldn't move. He tried to speak, but the sounds wouldn't reach her ears. He tried to understand what was happening, but there were no answers. The fog thickened, swallowing his every breath, every step. You want to find meaning in this, she continued, her gaze somehow blending seamlessly with the surrounding fog, but this is not the place to find answers. You are not here to understand. You are here to forget. Everything you knew, everything you saw, was just part of a game. A game you cannot win, but you cannot lose, either. I don't understand, he said, feeling his words disappear into the space. Why does everything change? Why can't I go back? Alia didn't answer right away. She stood there, as if thinking. Her eyes showed some kind of endless weariness, as if she had lived through all this a million times already. And it was terrifyingly familiar. You can't go back, she said finally. You can't go back because this world doesn't exist for you. You were torn from it, and now you're here, in this in-between space. You were part of a task, and the task was completed. You can't go back because there's no way back. You just have to be here. Michael felt his body begin to fade. He began to lose sensation, as if all his physical sensations were beginning to blur, to disappear. He could no longer hold on to his existence. He was a part of this world, but he couldn't understand what that meant. He tried to look at Alia, but her figure began to disappear again. He could feel her presence, but her image became more and more blurred. She was disappearing just like everything that had happened before. Suddenly a new image appeared before him. A man. He stood a few feet away, and his gaze was empty, as if he were a ghost. This was a man Michael did not know, but he felt familiar. He was part of this world, part of this process. You want to understand, the man said, his voice quiet but with an unusual firmness, but you can't. Understanding is meaningless here. You just have to accept what's happening. Michael didn't know what to say. He tried to take a step forward, but his legs wouldn't obey him anymore. He was connected to this space, to this world, and all he could do was stand there and look at those around him, but he couldn't understand who they were. Why is this? Why am I here? He said, but the answer was no longer for him. The man simply stood and looked at him, as if he were part of this world, part of its architecture, part of its destruction. Michael realized he couldn't move. He couldn't think. He couldn't find his way. He was just here. And if he could ever get out of this, it would just be a new stage, a new beginning. He felt the fog thickening again, the world becoming less dense. And when he tried to look around, there was nothing. Everything was gone. Everything was gone, as if it had never existed. The fog swallowed him up, leaving only a feeling of loss and emptiness. Michael woke up again. Or maybe he had been here for a long time, and waking up was just an illusion created by his own mind trying to regain control. At this moment, it was hard to tell where reality ended and where his consciousness began. He looked around. There was no horizon, no light around his figure. No sky, nothing but black space that pressed down on him in its silence. He began to walk, but his feet did not touch the ground. He was suspended between dimensions, not knowing which world he was in. Every movement seemed slow, as if time could not find its rhythm. There was silence in his ears and an endless rustling in his head. Everything he saw was jumbled, and he felt his own body begin to dissolve into this emptiness. Then the same man from before appeared in front of him again. But now he was a little different. His face was familiar and yet alien, as if he had changed, but Michael couldn't say exactly how. He wore the same clothes, the same dark glasses that created his image. The man's gaze was cold, but still a little ironic, as if he were an observer who saw everything at once, but did not interfere. "You're here again," he said calmly, as if it were inevitable. "Where am I?" Michael asked, unable to understand what was happening. The man looked at him, but did not answer right away. He seemed to be thinking, looking at him, as if he wanted to see something more in him than just tiredness and confusion. "You're here because you can't be anywhere else." His voice was quiet and empty, as if each word had been squeezed out of this world, like a drop falling into an empty barrel. "Your attempts to find a way out will lead to nothing but new layers of delusion. You can't understand what's happening because this world doesn't exist to understand." Michael felt a heavy, oppressive feeling squeeze his chest. He tried to understand, tried to find something that could explain everything that was happening. He was ready to accept that this was an illusion. He was ready to believe that this was a dream, that his consciousness was simply driving him in circles. But it was too much for his mind. The fog was getting thicker. Every particle of air was saturated with an unbearable heaviness. He wanted to understand what this place was and why he was here, but his thoughts were becoming more and more disordered. "You're not here to understand," the man repeated, with surprising calm. "You're here to forget." Forget. The word caught Michael's attention. He couldn't understand how it was possible to forget everything that had happened. But then his gaze fell on the ground, or what should have been the ground. It wasn't the ground, but a kind of milky white substrate that had no shape but was felt. He felt his feet sinking into that space, and he couldn't understand how that was possible. He tried to break free, but his body no longer obeyed him. "What do you want to forget?" the man asked, as if he could read his thoughts. He stood there, motionless, his shadow spreading across the empty world. "You can't go back to the past, Michael. Because it never existed for you." Michael winced. He felt the question creeping into his mind. He didn't know how to answer it. All he knew was that the world around him was changing. He couldn't remember how he got here, and he couldn't understand what had brought him to this place. His mind was empty. The only thing he felt was fear of what he couldn't know. The man stepped forward. His face was very close now. It became brighter, as if it was glowing from within. And in those eyes Michael saw something strange. It was something very similar to pity, but also to understanding. He knew that this man knew everything. But what exactly he knew, Michael could not understand. "You were torn from your world," the man continued. "And here you must realize that the world you came from was not real either. It was created to break you. You were part of a program you could not finish. And now you must be here, in this space where there is no past and no future. Only a constant here. Only emptiness." Michael gritted his teeth. He couldn't believe that everything he knew didn't exist. Everything he'd done, everything he'd experienced, it was all part of something bigger than he could comprehend. He wasn't just an observer. He was part of a game he couldn't win. He felt his mind going hazy. All he wanted was to just leave, to get out of this world and find something that mattered. "This is not the end," the man said, as if he had read his mind. "It is the beginning. And now you must be ready to complete this cycle. You cannot go back. You cannot escape what you must complete." At that moment, Michael felt his body begin to lose shape again. He was nothing more than an image, nothing more than a part of this emptiness, dissolving into eternity. He wanted to scream, but he couldn't. He wanted to understand, but he couldn't. And then the space in front of him began to distort. The world around him disappeared, and he found himself again in the very place where it all began, in an empty space full of fog. He was again standing on the edge between reality and illusion, between what was and what was yet to be. But now he was not sure that there was a difference between these worlds. Michael found himself in the void again. But the void was different now. It was no longer cold and lifeless as before. It was beginning to take on strange shapes, unclear and unsteady, as if reality itself was beginning to tremble, to blur before his eyes. He didn't know how much time had passed, how long he had been in this gap, but the feeling of being lost didn't leave him. He tried to figure out where he was, what was happening, but the answers didn't come. He looked around and saw that new figures had appeared around him. They were standing far away in the half-light, but their silhouettes were familiar. They were people he knew, although he could not remember exactly when or where he had met them. One of them was in a military uniform, tall, with an expression on his face as if he was on the verge of despair and ready to fight to the end. The other figure was a woman, her face hidden, but he could feel her presence, subtle as a breath he could not hold. He approached them, but no one responded. He spoke, but words were powerless in this world. It was the moment when all attempts to find a way out began to be perceived as something ridiculous. But Michael could not stop. He continued walking, despite the inner emptiness, despite the feeling that his consciousness was beginning to fall apart. "You are here to complete your cycle," said the man who appeared before him again, his face the same, but there was something new in his eyes now, more understanding, as if he knew what was happening. "Your role was always here. You had to see that you could not leave, and that you could not find a way out." Michael couldn't speak. He could only watch as the figures around him slowly began to fade, dissolving into the fog. He tried to grab their hand, but his fingers touched nothing but emptiness. It was as if he was part of this world, but at the same time, he was separate from it. As if his presence didn't matter. But he knew there was more. He felt his consciousness reaching for understanding, for awareness of what was happening around him. He knew he was part of something far more complex than he could imagine. "You want to know what's going on?" the man continued, his voice a little quieter now, as if he himself felt that every word he said could destroy this delicate balance. "But you can't. The answers aren't here for you. You were pulled out of your reality because you had to be a witness. But you can't be part of this world. You have to stay here, in this gap." Michael couldn't understand what it meant. He felt his mind struggling with it, trying to find even one thread to grab onto. He searched for answers in every detail, in every moment, but everything he found was empty. Everything around him was an illusion. Or maybe it was a reality in which all of this existed at once. "You think you've lost everything," the man said, his gaze no longer directed at Michael, but into the very depths of this void where there was no time or space. "But you haven't lost anything. You were in the world you created, and now you have to understand that there is no way back. You have to come back here, to be a part of it all." At that moment, Michael felt his body begin to disappear, as if it were dissolving into thin air. At that moment, he realized that this was not a dream, not an illusion. He was part of something bigger. He was part of a structure he could not understand. And now that he was beginning to feel it, his consciousness was beginning to break. He looked at the man, and his gaze became clearer, as if he had just realized something important that he had not been able to understand before. "You don't understand," he said, but there was no longer any indifference in his voice. There was a tragic certainty in it now. "You will never understand. You were created not to understand. You must complete the cycle, because that was your destiny." Michael stood there, unable to move, unable to think. It was as if he was trapped. He tried to remember who he was, what he had done before he had ended up here. But all he could remember was the emptiness that was swallowing him up. His body was part of that emptiness, and now perhaps he was part of it. He saw a figure approaching him. It was Aya. She stood before him, and her face was just as he remembered it, warm and alive. But in her eyes again was the same look as everyone else who was here. It was a look that knew no pity. It was a look that saw more than anyone else could understand. "You can't go back," she said, her voice quiet but as determined as the man's. "You must complete your cycle. This is not your world. You were torn from it to become part of something else. And now you must understand that your role is complete." Michael felt his mind breaking again, everything he had ever known disappearing again. He couldn't believe that everything he had experienced was part of this cycle. He couldn't believe that he couldn't return to the world that was his. But he also knew that it wasn't just his perception, it was reality itself, independent of his wishes. At that moment, the space in front of him disappeared, and he found himself in that very empty place where there was neither time nor light. He was here again, in that gap where everything was unclear, and only one thing remained unchanged: emptiness. He tried to move, but he couldn't anymore. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know what would happen next. All he knew was that he was here. And now, maybe this was what he was meant to be. Michael didn't know how much time had passed since he had arrived here. He had lost all sense of time, as if the very emptiness around him was swallowing everything: his thoughts, his feelings, his memory. It was as if everything had already been decided, and now he was part of something bigger, something nameless. He was not just an observer, but a part of this world, this in-between space that did not exist in his previous reality. Suddenly, the same man appeared before him again, a man in dark glasses. His face was the same, but it was increasingly blurry, like fog that cannot find its shape. He looked at Michael the way one looks at someone who knows that his fate has long been predetermined. It was the look of an observer who was waiting for the end of the game. "You're here again," the man said. He spoke calmly, as if it were the most natural thing. His voice was level, but there was a hint of unease in it now. It wasn't unease about what was happening, but about what wasn't. He knew something should have changed, but it hadn't. Michael stood before him, but the words wouldn't come to him. He wanted to ask what was happening, but his tongue felt constrained. He couldn't believe that this was his reality, that this place existed parallel to the world he knew. There was only one word spinning in his head: forget. "Why am I here?" he finally squeezed out. The man didn't answer right away. He stepped aside and looked into the distance, into the void, as if he were watching something too far away to reach. His gaze was alien, unlit. "You can't know what's happening," he said finally. "You can't understand it. And you never will. You were torn from your world because you had to be a part of it. You had to be the one to see what happened. You were part of a system that couldn't be completed. And now you have to be here." Michael felt his heart skip a beat. He couldn't understand what this meant. He was part of something? He was made to see something? But what? "None of this is accidental, Michael," the man continued, as if he could read his thoughts. "You were meant to walk this path. You were meant to find the answers. And now you are meant to stay here. But why me? Why was I ripped away?" Michael asked again, his voice no longer as confident. He felt his body begin to shake, this sense of loss washing over him, and he couldn't find the strength to resist. The man finally turned and looked him straight in the eyes. His gaze was strangely deep, as if he saw all his fears and doubts. He did not look away, did not hesitate. He was infinitely distant and yet close. "Because you were one of those who could understand," he said. "But you can't understand until you accept your role." Michael felt his consciousness begin to lose shape. He felt his thoughts blurring, the world around him blurring. He had no control over what was happening anymore, and this feeling of loss of control was the most frightening thing of all. He didn't know what to do. He didn't know how to be. But he felt like he had to understand something, see something, before this world disappeared completely. But nothing happened. Then, unable to contain himself any longer, he shouted, "Where is she? Where is Alia? Is she here too?" The man was silent for a moment. His face hardened, as if he was trying to hide some emotion he couldn't show. He took a step back and looked at Michael. "She was here," he finally answered. "But she wasn't part of this. She couldn't be. You brought her here yourself. You created her image yourself. And now that you're faced with this, you'll realize that you can't go back to the world that was." Michael closed his eyes, feeling his mind begin to crumble again. He tried to find some answers, some memories, but everything was fading. He didn't know if Alia was real, or if she was just part of his own idea of what was important. He didn't know if this world was real, and he might never know. When he opened his eyes, the man had disappeared. His place was taken by a misty figure, which gradually became clearer. It was Alia. She stood before him, her face the same as he remembered, but her eyes were empty. She was silent, and Michael didn't know what to say to her. He knew she couldn't be here, that her place was somewhere else. But now, in this moment, she was in front of him, and he didn't know how to process it. Alia stepped forward, her movements fluid, as if she were part of this world, part of its unconscious efforts. She raised her hand, and he felt how her touch was the only real feeling he had left in this world. He realized that her presence was not just a memory, she was part of this paradox, part of what he could not understand. "We're all here," she said, her voice calmer than before. "We're all part of what was and what will be. But you have to understand now, Michael, that everything you've known, everything you've seen, is not the end. It's the beginning. You were ripped away because you were meant to be a part of it. And now you're here." She came closer and looked into his eyes, and Michael felt her gaze absorb everything around him. He knew he couldn't go back. He was here, and he would stay here forever. Everything he knew was gone, and everything that was left undefined. And in that moment, the emptiness around them began to disappear. Everything began to dissolve, as if they were becoming part of something bigger. But what it was, he didn't know. Michael disappeared again. Michael woke up. He felt the air rushing into his lungs, as if he had just escaped from an underwater world. For the first few seconds, he couldn't understand what was happening. There was silence in his head, but it wasn't empty. Everything was unclear, blurry, like an old movie shot on film, in which the scenes changed too quickly for it to be possible to understand what is happening on the screen. He looked around. Everything was normal: the walls, the ceiling, the desk with papers. He was in a room he knew well, but he couldn't remember when or why he knew it. Something stirred inside him, but it wasn't a feeling he could put into words. It was more than just fear. It was a feeling of being trapped in a bottomless pit, yet still visible. He stood up, slowly took a step forward. The room was empty, and it seemed as if everything was as it should be. But no, he felt that something was wrong. He didn't know what, but he was sure this reality was not the one he once knew. He looked at his hand. His fingers felt alien, as if he were looking at a complete stranger's hands. He ran his hand over his face, feeling the warmth of his skin, but somehow he couldn't remember how he had gotten here, in this place. The pain in his head was too strong to ignore. It was as if it was trying to bend reality, stretching it like a taut string. Michael walked to the door and opened it. He found himself in a hallway that looked familiar, but not like before. There was something strange about it. His footsteps echoed, as if this world had no depth. Everything seemed flat, without dimension. He knew he had to move forward, but he didn't know where. Suddenly he heard a sound. It was a step. Light, quick, as if someone was watching him. Michael stopped. The sound was repeated, but this time it was closer. Michael felt his heart beat faster. And then, in the corridor, a figure came around the corner. Alia. She stood in the half-shadow, and her gaze was the same as before. He couldn't understand why her presence here, in this emptiness, suddenly became so desperate. Why her face became so unfamiliar. But there was something in her eyes that didn't allow him to turn away. Alia stepped forward, her face clearer, but her movements remained fluid, as if she were moving through viscous space. She did not speak, but Michael knew that she felt the same as he did. It was all part of what they had experienced together, but there was something new, inexpressible in her gaze. He noticed that her clothes were alien, as if they came from another time. "You're here again," she said, her voice as calm as it had been when she disappeared into the void. She wasn't coming closer, but her presence was as inescapable as the shadow that followed him. Michael was at a loss for words. He looked at her, trying to figure out what was real and what was just an illusion created by his mind. He tried to ask himself a question, but he couldn't answer it. "You understand everything, Michael," Alia said, her voice seeming to penetrate his consciousness. "You're here because you were meant to be here. You can't go back because you've already walked this path. You were torn from reality to see that you were part of something bigger. You became part of this game because you were meant to be part of it." Michael tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come. He felt everything around him starting to lose shape again, the space around him becoming shaky and unstable again. "You must not be afraid," Alia continued. "You must understand that reality is not as you imagined it. You have already walked this path, and now you are here, in this place. You cannot go back. You must stay here, because everything you have seen, everything you have experienced is part of an endless game that has no beginning and no end. And you are not alone in this." Michael felt his body blurring again, as if he was becoming part of the void, part of the very world that was inexplicable to him. He realized that he would never find an answer, that this game would never end. But suddenly a thought flashed in his head. He remembered something, a flicker of a memory that was so real, he could almost touch it. It was a picture. He and Alia, sitting in some cafe where the light was dim, but their faces were clear and happy. They were laughing. It was a moment when they were alive. He didn't know what it was, but he knew that this moment was true. This memory was part of him, part of who he was before everything changed. He was connected to this world, to this moment. And maybe that was the key. But no matter how hard he tried to hold on to this moment, he felt it slipping away. Reality was beginning to dissolve again. Alia, his face, all of it, was disappearing. And with it, Michael himself, his existence, his memory, his life. "You can't go back," Alia said, her voice like a quiet whisper in a space where there was no longer time. Michael could no longer resist. He felt his consciousness slowly slipping away, becoming part of what surrounded him, the void, the space that had no form or meaning. And one last time, before everything disappeared completely, Michael realized one thing. The answers he was looking for weren't in this world. They were in another, in a world he could never understand. He disappeared. And there was nothing left.
More interesting thing to come. Be sure to watch the next video or check you the playlist. There you will find even more yourself and exciting. Thanks for the likes, comments and your support. It really helps to develop the channel.